Lieutenant Junior Grade Asbury Salinger had been flying anti-submarine patrols for weeks without result. That changed on the morning of August 7th, 1943. He was flying an Avenger torpedo bomber off the escort carrier Card in the Central Atlantic, about 500 miles west of the Azores. His job was to look for submarines. What he found at 11:54 was two of them, sitting on the surface together in broad daylight. Neither was diving. One was alongside the other, fuel lines connected, in the middle of a resupply operation. Two submarines and a tangle of hoses. One of them was the kind of boat that kept the whole German submarine campaign running. The other was there because it needed fuel to get home. Salinger dropped depth charges between them and radioed for help. 20 minutes later, 4 more aircraft arrived from the Card. Together, they hit the larger vessel with an acoustic homing torpedo. It went down with all hands. The other submarine dove and ran. It survived. The boat that sank was U-117. She hadn't been hunting Allied ships that day. She'd been sent to help a damaged submarine get home. According to German submarine doctrine, that kind of humanitarian mission was supposed to earn some protection, or at least some benefit of the doubt. It didn't. The Allies were learning that the fastest way to cripple the German submarine campaign wasn't to hunt individual wolves. It was to burn down the supply line that kept them alive. To understand what was at stake when the Allies started hunting supply submarines, you have to understand what those supply submarines made possible. By 1942, the German submarine campaign faced a geography problem. The most productive hunting grounds were in the middle of the Atlantic, far from the Allied escort network and far from Allied air coverage. But getting there burned fuel. Coming home burned more. A Type 7 submarine, Germany's workhorse boat, about 67 meters long, could reach the Central Atlantic on a full tank and still have enough fuel to operate for roughly 2 weeks before turning for home. 2 weeks. That was the combat window before the math forced a retreat. Admiral Dönitz wanted more. More time on patrol meant more ships sunk. More ships sunk meant more pressure on Allied supply lines. The whole theory of the submarine campaign depended on keeping combat submarines in productive water as long as possible. Refueling at sea was the solution. Germany built 10 Type 14 submarines specifically for this purpose. They were called Milchquähe, milch cows, milk cows. Each one was nearly 68 meters long, displaced almost 1,700 tons, submerged, and carried no offensive weapons at all. No torpedoes, no deck guns designed for attack. What they carried instead was fuel, 430 tons of it, plus spare torpedoes, food, and medical supplies. One milch cow could extend the patrols of a dozen combat submarines. In theory, submarines could stay at sea indefinitely, refueling as needed from a milch cow in open ocean. The first Type 14 to commission was U-459, which went operational in early 1942 under Commander Georg von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff. German submarine commanders described early refueling operations as transformative. The U-boat war in the Central Atlantic suddenly had legs it hadn't possessed before. Patrols stretched from 6 weeks to 12. Tonnage sunk per patrol increased. For roughly 18 months, the system worked well enough that it became the structural foundation of the entire Wolfpack campaign. A mid-Atlantic refueling was not a quick operation. The supply submarine and the combat boat had to find each other in open ocean, which required radio coordination and precise navigation. Once alongside, fuel lines went across. Torpedoes were transferred by hand if needed. Fresh food came aboard. Real food, not the tinned rations that accumulated for weeks in a submarine's forward compartment. Letters from home sometimes came too, forwarded from base to the milch cow to the combat boat. Medical emergencies could be treated. The supply submarine carried a doctor. Minor repairs could be made. For a crew that had been at sea for 6 weeks, a milch cow rendezvous was the closest thing to civilization available in the middle of the ocean. It was also, by mid-1943, a gathering of multiple submarines sitting still on the surface together. Fuel lines connected, boats alongside each other, men transferring supplies by hand, all of them stationary for hours. The submarine commanders who relied on this system understood its vulnerability in the abstract. Being stationary on the surface in the Atlantic was dangerous under any circumstances. Being stationary with multiple boats visible from any aircraft that happened overhead was worse. But there was no alternative. You needed the fuel. You surfaced. You connected the lines. You stayed up until the transfer was complete, and the milch cow crew, who would repeat this process with another boat at another rendezvous in another week, did the same thing again and again across months of operations that each one of them could calculate. In quiet moments, were getting more dangerous. That was the job. They kept doing it. That made it the most important target in the Atlantic, and by mid-1943, the Allies knew exactly where to find it. Allied codebreakers had been working on German naval communications since early in the war, and by 1943 they were reading the German Navy's signals with enough regularity to act on them. The specific thing that made the milch cow campaign vulnerable was straightforward. Refueling required coordination. Submarines had to know where the tanker would be. The tanker had to know where the submarines were. That coordination required radio messages. Those radio messages were transmitted in the Enigma cipher. Allied intelligence broke enough of those messages to know the rendezvous positions before the ships arrived at them. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command's H-gram account, Ultra intercepts were involved in sinking all 11 submarines destroyed by the escort carrier Card's hunter-killer groups, and nearly all U-boats sunk in the Atlantic by American hunter-killer groups during the war. The hunter-killer groups themselves were the delivery mechanism. A small escort carrier, not a fleet carrier, a smaller converted merchant ship that could carry around 24 aircraft, could cross the Atlantic with a screen of destroyers and operate in exactly the areas where submarines gathered to refuel. The aircraft could range far enough to catch boats on the surface. The acoustic homing torpedo, codenamed Fido, gave them a weapon that chased submarines underwater. The combination of ultra-intelligence and hunter-killer groups was specifically effective against supply operations for a reason that's almost brutally simple. A combat submarine on patrol could be anywhere in millions of square miles of ocean. You couldn't easily ambush it because you didn't know where it was going, but a supply submarine had to go to a specific set of coordinates at a specific time. The receiving submarines had to be there too. Multiple boats converging on one spot, sitting still on the surface together. The milch cow system that made the wolf packs powerful also made them vulnerable in a very particular way. It created appointments, and appointments can be kept by whoever reads the mail. The first use of a Fido against a milch cow came on July 24, 1943. Commander Georg von Willamowitz-Muhlendorf had U-459 in the Bay of Biscay on her way out to a refueling rendezvous when 2 Royal Air Force Wellingtons from No. 172 Squadron found her on the surface. One Wellington was shot down by U-459's anti-aircraft guns. The other dropped depth charges that crippled the boat. Unable to dive, with the aircraft circling, Willamowitz-Muhlendorf ordered his crew to abandon ship and scuttled U-459. 41 of 59 crew survived and became prisoners. 18 died. The first Type 14 to commission was the first destroyed. That wasn't bad luck. The Wellingtons had been directed to the area by intelligence. The Bay of Biscay was becoming a gauntlet that supply submarines had to cross to reach the Atlantic. But the open ocean wouldn't be safe either. The story of U-117's last day is one of the stranger ones in the Atlantic campaign, because the chain of events that put her in Salinger's sights started with a humanitarian gesture that ended in disaster. U-117 wasn't a Type 14 milch cow. She was a Type XB, an even larger boat, originally designed as a mine layer. Her commander was Captain Hans Werner Neumann. On her final patrol, she'd left, Bordeaux in late July 1943, carrying 66 mines she was supposed to lay off New York City. Then, on July 27th, orders changed. U-66, another submarine heading toward North America, had been attacked by Card aircraft on August 3rd and badly mauled. The executive officer was killed. The commander, Captain Friedrich Markworth, and 8 other men were wounded. U-66 couldn't dive properly and needed medical help. U-boat headquarters redirected U-117 to the rendezvous. On August 6th, U-117 reached U-66 in the open Atlantic. She transferred her ship's doctor, Dr. Schenk, and a new executive officer to replace the one who'd been killed. The doctor treated the wounded men aboard U-66 and saved the lives of the 2 most seriously injured. The U-boat.net record states that Dr. Schenk was able to save both men. Neumann then began refueling U-66 from U-117's tanks. The 2 boats were alongside each other and next morning, when Salinger's Avenger arrived, the first pass dropped depth charges between the hulls. Both boats were rattled, but not immediately sunk. U-66 crash dove and ran. U-117 couldn't go fast enough to escape before 4 more aircraft from the Card arrived and made her dive. The acoustic torpedo found her underwater. U-117 sank with all hands. The crew count in various sources puts the total between 62 and 63 men. None came back. Neumann, who'd been diverted from a mine-laying mission to help a wounded crew, was dead. The doctor who'd just saved 2 lives was dead. Every man aboard was dead. Their boat went down in the central Atlantic, somewhere around 39 degrees north, 38 degrees west. What the surviving crew of U-66 saw from underwater as their sonar operator tracked the explosions above them is unrecorded. What they knew, surfacing later, was that the boat that had just given them a doctor, given them a new executive officer, given them fuel, that boat was gone. All of it at the bottom, within hours of the transfer. U-66 brought no luck to the supply boats, the U-boat.net record notes dryly. Several milch cows tasked with assisting U-66 were sunk in the process. U-66 made it back to Lorient. She went back out on another patrol. She was finally sunk in May 1944, almost a year later, by the destroyer escort Buckley after a lengthy surface engagement. Markworth, the commander who had been wounded in that first Card attack, had by then been replaced. The boat that kept surviving outlasted the supply network that had saved it. Herbert Werner was the executive officer on U-230 during the summer of 1943, and he later wrote about it in his memoir Iron Coffins. What he describes from that period isn't tactical analysis. It's something closer to watching a structure collapse. U-230 was at sea when the radio messages started. Arriving. Not distress signals, exactly. Just the facts. Submarines calling for position of the tanker. Then no answer from the tanker. Then headquarters sending a new position. Then silence from that position too. Werner described intercepting signals from 3 different milch cows. All of them sunk in rapid succession. The rendezvous positions kept going cold. U-230 eventually ran down to her last 2 tons of fuel. With nothing in the tanks and no tanker responding, Werner and his captain Paul Siegmann had to figure out how to get home. Headquarters directed them to another submarine, U-634, which had enough fuel left to share. The 2 boats found each other at sea. U-634 pumped what she could spare into U-230. Then both were directed to a surviving milch cow to top off. Werner wrote years later that when U-230 finally reached the tanker, he was struck by the attitude of her crew. The tanker sailors seemed relaxed, almost casual, in a way that struck Werner as disconnected from reality. He described it in Iron Coffins as a seemingly complacent attitude, men going about their work as if the losses all around them hadn't changed the situation. Werner had spent weeks watching the milch cows disappear one by one. The men who crewed the surviving tanker seemed not to have absorbed what that meant. Think about what that must have felt like on a combat submarine by mid-1943. You've been at sea for weeks. The patrol has been difficult. You need fuel to get home. You surface at the coordinates you've been given, and the tanker isn't there. You wait. You transmit. Nothing. You request new coordinates. You travel to the new position, burning fuel you can't spare, and find the same emptiness. The boat that was supposed to be there was sunk weeks ago. There's a photo of it somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic, all 60-odd men still aboard. And then the next set of coordinates. And then you go there too. The problem for German submarine commanders by late 1943 was that they had no explanation they could trust. Each individual milch cow sinking could be attributed to bad luck, to an aircraft stumbling across the rendezvous, to poor weather conditions, to any number of tactical failures. The idea that the coordinates themselves were being read in England before the boats arrived, that the appointments were known to the Allies before the Germans made them, was too enormous a compromise to fully accept. It meant the entire command structure was compromised. It meant every scheduled meeting was a potential ambush. It meant there was no safe way to do the thing the campaign required. German Submarine Command discussed the possibility of a security leak repeatedly during 1943. They investigated. They changed procedures. They never broke the pattern of losses because the problem wasn't a leak in the ordinary sense. The Enigma machine itself was compromised. The cipher that seemed unbreakable was being read, not by finding the key, but by the accumulated mathematical work at Bletchley Park that nobody in Germany believed was possible. The men at sea couldn't know any of this. All they knew was that the tankers weren't at the coordinates anymore. All they could do was follow the next set of orders, surface at the next meeting point, and hope that this time the aircraft wouldn't come. By October 1943, the Allies had sunk 4 of the 10 Type 14 milch cows. The other supply types, the Type XBs and a few modified combat submarines pressed into refueling duties, were dying at roughly the same rate. The Atlantic was becoming a bad place to be a large submarine sitting still. The most productive milch cow of the entire program was U-460. According to the naval-encyclopedia.com account of the Type 14 program, U-460 resupplied 86 submarines during her service, more than any other boat of her class. Her commander was Friedrich Schnorr. The crew who served on her were not the men who sank ships. They were the ones who made it possible for other men to keep sinking ships. Mechanics, fuel handlers, supply specialists. They kept submarines operational when the math would have otherwise forced a retreat. On October 4th, 1943, at 9 in the morning, Lieutenant Robert Stearns took his Avenger off the deck of the escort carrier card and found 4 submarines on the surface within 500 yards of each other, north of the Azores. The Naval History and Heritage Command's H. Graham account describes the scene. U-460 had just finished refueling U-264 and was alongside U-422, while U-455 was waiting her turn. Stearns radioed for backup and immediately attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire from the assembled submarines. His 500-pound bomb dropped between U-460 and U-422. The card launched 3 more aircraft. The battle that followed sank U-460 and U-422. The acoustic homing torpedo finished U-460. 62 of her crew went down. 2 survived. U-264 and U-455 escaped damaged. 62 men. The most effective fuel supply submarine the Germans had. Sunk by an aircraft sent to coordinates that had been read in England before the boats arrived. Think about what that means from Schnorr's perspective if he had any warning at all, which is unknowable, since there were no survivors to ask. 4 submarines on the surface together, all of them shooting at the incoming aircraft. The milch cow was a large, slow target with no offensive armament. Her crew could fire at the Avengers. They couldn't dive fast enough to escape them. The only real option was to trust that the anti-aircraft fire from 4 boats would be enough to drive off the attackers. It wasn't. It never was, against a hunter-killer group that had been sent directly to the position. U-264 which had just received its fuel from U-460 and escaped that attack, was itself sunk 4 months later. In February 1944, British warships found U-264 southwest of Ireland. That crew had survived October, had gotten home, had gone out again. They didn't survive February. Not every milch cow was sunk in an obvious ambush. Some died in circumstances that took longer to unravel. U-463 was one of the earlier losses. She'd been operating successfully in the Bay of Biscay transit routes since April 1942. On May 16, 1943, a British Halifax bomber from No. 58 Squadron of the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command caught U-463 on the surface in the Bay of Biscay and dropped depth charges that went off close enough to prevent diving. There were no survivors. Her entire crew went down. A number U-boat.net records as a full wartime crew for the type. She'd been resupplying wolves in the Atlantic for over a year. She was gone in an afternoon. The loss of U-462 came a week later, on July 30th, 1943, again in the Bay of Biscay. 2 Royal Air Force bombers found her near Cape Ortegal off the northwest coast of Spain. One Wellington was shot down by U-462's anti-aircraft guns. The other attacked with depth charges. The depth charges were near misses, but they left U-462 unable to dive and badly damaged. With aircraft overhead and no ability to escape underwater, her captains scuttled her. The Naval Encyclopedia account records 41 survivors who became prisoners. 18 or more crew died. The pattern in the Bay of Biscay deaths is worth noting. The supply submarines fought back hard. They had better anti-aircraft armament than standard combat submarines, and their crews used it. One Wellington was shot down trying to sink U-462. Another was shot down trying to sink U-459 before she was eventually lost. The milch cow crews were not passive targets. They understood that surfacing in the Bay of Biscay by mid-1943 was an invitation to an attack. They went out anyway because the combat submarines needed fuel and headquarters sent them. The last Type 14 milch cow to be sunk was U-488. She died on April 26, 1944, in the mid-Atlantic, caught by 4 destroyer escorts from the escort carrier Croatan's Hunter-Killer Group. No survivors from a crew of 64. By that point, U-488 was the last operational Type 14 in the Atlantic. The U-66, which had been waiting to refuel from her, received the news that there was no longer a milch cow to meet. 4 days later, U-66 was itself sunk by the destroyer escort Buckley. That sequence, the tanker sunk, the boat waiting for it sunk 4 days later, is as clean a summary as the whole campaign produced. The supply chain broke. Then the combat boat broke. In that order, with 4 days between them. The destruction of the milch cow fleet didn't happen in isolation. It was the final weight added to a structure already under pressure. By mid-1943, Allied convoy escorts were better organized. Aircraft coverage had expanded. The acoustic homing torpedo was killing submarines that had previously been safe once they dove. Black May 1943, had cost Germany 41 submarines in a single month. Donitz had briefly withdrawn the wolf packs from the North Atlantic in late May to avoid total collapse. But wolves without fuel can't hunt, and that's what the milch cow losses ultimately produced. Once the Type 14S were gone, submarines still needed to refuel. The replacement was improvised resupply from other combat submarines, which was dangerous, inefficient, and limited by how much a combat boat could spare, while still completing its own mission. The Mid-Atlantic, rendezvous points that had once hosted milch cows, refueling a dozen submarines now hosted awkward, hazardous transfers between 2 combat boats running low simultaneously. The result, according to the H. Graham account of the Hunter-Killer campaign, was that mid-ocean wolf pack. Operations effectively collapsed. Submarines still went out. They still sank ships. But the coordinated campaign that had nearly severed the Allied supply line between North America and Britain, the campaign that Churchill later described as the one threat that genuinely frightened him, depended on wolves staying in position long enough to gather and attack together. Without the fuel supply that made extended stays possible, patrols shortened, coordination failed, and the numbers that had made the wolf packs effective broke apart. On May 23, 1943, Dönitz sent a signal to his submarine force acknowledging the losses. He told his crews they faced a difficult time and that they must endure it. He didn't tell them that the supply infrastructure they depended on was already being systematically destroyed because Allied codebreakers were reading the messages he used to schedule the resupply operations. The crews going out in late 1943 and into 1944 knew the milch cows were dying. They didn't know why. Some commanders suspected an informant, some blamed improved Allied radar, some blamed coincidence. The orders kept coming from headquarters. Rendezvous at these coordinates. Receive fuel. Continue patrol. The coordinates kept becoming ambush sites. A few boats refused to surface at rendezvous points when the timing felt wrong. A few commanders shortened their patrols and came home early rather than risk a refueling operation that might be compromised. Some simply ran out of fuel before a solution arrived, drifting while headquarters sent coordinates to milch cows that no longer existed. The improvised submarine-to-submarine transfers that filled the gap were dangerous, slow, and couldn't replicate what the Type 14 boats had provided. 2 combat submarines passing fuel through a hose in open ocean, both on the surface, both running low. That was the new reality. The campaign that followed was fought by men who understood, even if they couldn't articulate it, that the structure they'd relied on was gone, and that nothing adequate had replaced it. The wolf packs kept going out. They sank fewer ships. They came home less often, 28,000. That's how many German submariners died in the Second World War. Out of roughly 39,000 who served, more than 7 out of 10. The highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the war, by most calculations. The men who crewed the milch cows are somewhere inside that number. 62 from U-460, 64 from U-488. All of U-117's crew, somewhere west of the Azores, where the Atlantic is deep enough that nothing rises. They weren't the men who sank the convoys. They were the men who made the convoys possible to attack. The fuel handlers and mechanics and supply officers who kept combat submarines operational past the point where the math would have ended their patrols. They volunteered for submarine service, knowing the risks. What most of them couldn't have known, and what headquarters in Germany couldn't tell them, even when they suspected it, was that the coordinates they were steaming toward had already been given to Allied forces before they arrived. That the appointments they were keeping were being kept by someone else too. That the rendezvous system, which had made the wolf packs something close to unstoppable in 1942, had become the mechanism by which they were dismantled in 1943. Friedrich Schnorr, who commanded U-460 through enough resupply operations to keep 86 submarines fighting, went down with his boat on October 4th, 1943. The 2 survivors were pulled from the water. No record in the sources consulted gives their names. Herbert Werner, who wrote Iron Coffins and who spent the summer of 1943 watching the tanker network collapse one radio signal at a time, survived the war. He died in Florida in April 2013, 92 years old. He was one of about 24 U-boat captains still alive when the fighting ended. His crewmates from U-230, the men who ran dry, waiting for a milch cow that had already been sunk. Most of them made it through the war. They were the lucky ones. Werner knew it. He said so in his book. The 28,000 didn't have the chance to write anything.